Yeah. Again, welcome everyone to the ProTech Anti-Racism Resiliency Dialogues workshops. This is the third in our series of the workshop that will engage community members to explore and unpack issues related to racism and other systemic discrimination facing racialized communities, especially in the context of COVID-19. So we are very excited to have our very good friends from CCNC Toronto join us today. But before we start the session, I would like to first maybe get a sense of who our participants are. So Rain, actually before then, let us introduce our own team who's been working hard to put this together. So our community engagement coordinator, Rain, our project manager, Keith, and our content manager, Cindy. So thanks everyone for your hard work. And if Ring can administer the first poll, that will give us a sense of who's joining us for the session. And also the session will be on Facebook Live, and after the session, we will load it up to our YouTube channel so you can watch and share it with your friends as much as you can.
Everyone finish here?
So all of us are co-hosts, so we can participate.
Okay, so I'm gonna start the poll now, unless someone still has to do it.
Okay. So thank you again. So before we start the session, we would like to pay our respect and start with our land acknowledgement. If Rain can do the honor, appreciate it.
So with gratitude and respect, we here acknowledge that we are gathering on the sacred land that is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Toronto is on the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bounds them to share this territory and protect this land. Other Indigenous nations and people, as well as Europeans and all other newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect as well. We need to be aware and continuing of the ongoing impact of colonialism, racism, and other forms of social injustice and inequities that disproportionately impacts the Indigenous people here in racialized communities in Canada and everywhere else. We stand in solidarity to continue our fight against anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-Asian, and all other forms of racism and social oppressions locally and globally.
Thank you, Rain. So we are very honored and privileged to have some of our colleagues and friends from the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter with us today. Kenneth Lin and Kelvin To. As you know that CCNC for Social Justice and CCNC Toronto chapter are both close collaborators with Project ProTech, and we've been working together since our developmental planning stages and work together on many different initiatives to address the very complex racism and discrimination that our communities and other racialized communities been experiencing since the beginning, and actually historically, but also exacerbated by the pandemic. So I would like to pass the time to our guests, Kenneth and Calvin, and they will introduce themselves and all the great work they're doing.
Thank you, Alan and Rain and Project ProTech. My name is Kenneth Lin. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm speaking today as the co-chair of Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter. Really happy today to be here to share and discuss this topic. And we also have Calvin.
Thanks very much, Kenneth. It's a pleasure to be here, a real honor to be speaking to all of you. Thanks so much for attending. I'll just talk very briefly about me before passing it back to Kenneth. My name is Calvin To. In Chinese, Do Zhen, you can feel free to call me either. First generation Chinese Canadian. Right now I'm a second year law student at Osgoode Hall Law School, and I am the host of the podcast, Voices of the Pandemic. And we can talk about that more, but for now I'll hand it back to Kenneth.
Mm-hmm. So a little bit of what CCNCTO is. We're an organization that some of us have actually been a part of throughout these 40 years that the organization has been around. We are an organization that is located in the city of Toronto that works specifically to promote equity, social justice, inclusive civic participation, and respect for diversity. 40 years ago, the reason why the organization came about was also because of very targeted racism that happened towards the Chinese Canadians on a CTV episode of the W5 program. And so it is quite reflective of even today as we talk about COVID racism, anti-Asian racism related to that has come up from COVID-19 that well, at risk and at times of crisis also created more opportunity for us to have opportunities to talk about this topic. As many of you may have heard, our organization has worked with the Chinese Canadian National Council of Social Justice, CSOC, the Chinese South Asian Legal Clinic, as well as a Vancouver group called CEN, Civic Engagement Network, together with funding from Canadian Heritage, federal funding, that we've been able to create a website called covidracism.ca. Many of you may have heard of this as a reporting tool, and this reporting tool is very much for individuals to self-report as well as witnesses of incidents of anti-Asian racism that has come up because of COVID-19. Just some background, end of January, early February, when COVID, before it even hit Toronto, before the first case arrived, it was already in obviously Wuhan, China, and we were seeing some of this racism that was targeted towards Chinese Canadians happen. And so overnight, some of the members of the board came together to create a very grassroots version, a Google form sort of documentation for individuals to report. And soon after, as not only the virus as a crisis, but racism as a crisis continued, we were able to get the funding. So what you see today as at covidracism.ca as a reporting tool is a second version of that we launched end of May. Since then, we have had over 380 cases reported just to our site. We have been able to collaborate to work with another Vancouver project called Project 1907, who has a very similar reporting tool. And so our cases, as some of you may have seen in September this year, combined made at that time over 600 cases reported across the country, West Coast and East Coast. We're aware that other reporting tools have also popped up throughout this time, and very, very important work as well. But today we're really here to talk about COVID-19 racism and what we see from CCNCTO's perspective. So to start off, before we talk about the podcast that is so important and really excited for us to listen in together today, I want to give us some background and some historic context before we begin. When we talk about racism, we talk about anti-Asian racism, what we have to remember is that it is not a new phenomenon. Targeted racism towards Asian folks is not a new phenomenon. This targeted discrimination itself happens daily to communities and folks of Indigenous and Black communities, as well as those, for example, who are daily impacted by Islamophobia. For those like ourselves, East Asians presenting, we may have to also remember that racism has never really gone away. It's manifested in different ways, systemic ways, through ideas like the model minority myth, concrete examples in the workplace of bamboo ceiling, what people may call the Canadian experience when others who are professionally educated come to Canada and is not recognized for their qualifications, daily lives of individuals living in poverty, or experiences in white dominant spaces as seen as perpetual foreigners. And so in that way, systemic racism and racism in Canada has always existed. What is different though, that came around this year, and also a reminder of what happened in 2003 through the SARS epidemic, is this level of interpersonal level of violence that has stemmed from the pandemic, from COVID-19, something that many East Asians, particularly in urban settings in Canada, may not have experienced in decades. And so when we look further to even understand this phenomenon, we have to look back towards how this country came about. The country of Canada, built on stolen Indigenous land, began on a nation building project by European colonists who basically picked and chose who was allowed to be included as a rightful type of people to be part of this country. And so that meant that in the late 1800s, what Europeans saw as needed at that time was building a big railway infrastructure to connect the two parts of West Coast and East Coast of what we call Canada now. And they needed labor for that. And so at that time, when Chinese was then used as labor, even indentured labor, but when the railway was done, there was really nowhere to put Chinese people. And so the idea and the concept of yellow peril was introduced as a concept to create it so that basically this danger, this fear of Chinese and the danger to the West. Following this idea, we would know that many racist policies were then set to exclude Chinese Canadians and Chinese people. Fast forward to now, we still see this fear of Chinese come out not only as this perpetual foreigner concept and idea, but again, this danger to the West. And so it's important for us to recognize and see how this idea, built early on in this country, still sneaks in hidden and secretive ways through our everyday lives. And so when many people say that those who enacted these incidents of interpersonal violence towards Chinese or East Asian, or even there were cases of Inuit or Chinese presenting individuals, or that these people who've enacted this violence have always had this discriminating views and hatred within them. But I think for us at CCA and CTO, it's important for us to understand that this yellow peril as a context and help us ask questions to why it is so possible and why it was so easy for this targeted racism towards Chinese to come out so quickly, in this case, through the virus. And in the same way, then we would step back to ask why it is so easy for Black and Indigenous folks to be targeted in such violent daily interpersonal ways, and for them even without the presence of the virus. So just some questions for us to think through and some background context as we introduce today the podcast and as we discuss racism in public spaces. So this is how I want to situate our conversation today, that while it is important we take seriously what happens through these intense incidents of COVID-related racism, we have to also think in solidarity of how these not only are anti-Asian racism as a racism alone, but how anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism all relate to one another through this nation building project. For now, I believe we want to do the first poll. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. So we're gonna do a series of polls throughout our session just to gauge your experiences and your feelings related to the different incidents, and whether you have witnessed and experienced racism, or whether you know, and how you would choose to respond to it. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's just a way to kind of situate ourselves and to reflect our experiences collectively. So Rain, if you can administer the next couple of polls. So this is check everything that applies. So you can check multiple responses.
I think we're getting some response to say that multiple responses aren't allowed for the poll.
Shall we do it again? I can end the poll and then edit it and then try again. Shall we do that? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, so
Thanks, everyone.
so the next couple of poll questions really wanted to gauge whether we have experienced or witnessed racism in our own communities, in our own lives, or witness it happening to other communities. And then after each of the scenario, we wanted to see how we would choose to react and how we have responded. So if you can share your experiences during those polls, that would be much appreciated.
Sorry, I actually can't edit the polls right now. Yeah, I apologize. The setting of the poll might have been something that I didn't.
Maybe then I think even just the questions for us to consider throughout today's time. So maybe perhaps we can move on.
Yeah.
I think these 4 questions are really helpful for us to situate today's conversation and for all of us to begin this time together.
So maybe you can administer that again so people can choose at least one of the responses if they cannot choose multiple ones.
Okay, so
Okay, so there's 2 questions, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first question. So I guess the response is if you feel you do not know what to do, then you don't check any of the responses. Okay. So maybe we can close it.
Okay.
Thank you. So
Okay.
back
So
to you. Yeah.
yeah. So that being said, I'm going to pass the next portion to Kelvin.
Yeah, thanks very much. So now I'll just talk a bit about what the podcast is and how it came to be. and some of the information we know so far about the racism happening in light of COVID. So I first came to work at CCN-CTO last summer during an internship. Like I said, I'm a law student. Before that, I was a broadcast journalist. Worked in a few different provinces for a couple of the networks. So part of my work at CCN-CTO was social media monitoring. And so this was going online and finding and recording down incidents of anti-Asian racism on social media. And unfortunately, a lot of the times it wasn't that hard to find. There was a surge in anti-Asian racism, like Ken has mentioned, even before COVID arrived here in Canada. And since then, there have been incidents happening right across this country. In terms of what I found, it was pretty disturbing. Asians of all types were being targeted, not just Chinese. Many of the attackers were violent. They involved punching, spitting, coughing. Attackers often went after women and sometimes the elderly. The attacks often came with verbal harassment too. The attackers were blaming the victims for, bringing the virus here. Even if the victims were born here, even if they'd never been to Asia or China at all, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was their appearance. And it wasn't just Asians either. It was also people being mistaken for being Asian. In one case, an Indigenous woman was punched in the head in Vancouver while walking her dog. And so in terms of what we've received at covidracism.ca, that's where people can go online and report racist incidents that happen to them. I'd encourage you to do that if it happens to you. There have been more than 600 incidents. This is as of September. Most of the attacks happened in Vancouver and Toronto. 60% of the victims were women. 45% of the incidents happened in public places. And 83% of the victims were East Asian. Now, I got the idea for this podcast, Voices of the Pandemic, while I was going through these accounts of racism, thinking we need to raise awareness of this issue. There are a lot of people who are not aware that racism in terms of COVID against Asians, or that other racial groups are also bearing the brunt of COVID here. It's not falling equally. The effects of COVID are falling along racial lines. And a lot of people deny racism. But if we can show them that it exists, that's the first step in fighting it. And so I went through all the people who reported racist incidents that happened to them. And I reached out to them. I sent them emails. And understandably, most people did not get back to me. And I didn't expect them to, because racism is a really traumatic thing. It's very difficult for people to talk about, difficult for people to process. But a handful of people did reply to me. And when I told them what I was doing, they were very interested in speaking with me. And what struck me is they wanted to do it for the same reasons that I did. They wanted to shine a spotlight on what was happening. And so the idea for the podcast came when I listened to their stories. Their voices were so strong and their stories were so moving. I thought, more people need to hear this. I wanted it to be a place, the podcast, where you could hear directly from people who experience racism. I wanted it to be in their words. And so I interviewed them about their lives. And they were all Asians. Some are born here in Canada. Others came as immigrants. Some came when they were very young. Others came when they were older. And all of them experienced racism. And not just once or twice either, but throughout their entire lives. And we can talk a bit about this a bit later. I think it's something that many of us can relate to, experiencing racism throughout our lives. And by telling their stories, my goal is to empower their voices, because they're not just victims. I don't want them to be seen as victims. And if you've experienced racism too, I want you to know that you're not just a victim either. You have power. And together as a group, we have power. That power lies in our voices. Because if it's one thing that I've learned, is racism is not a normal thing. No one is born with it. People learn it. And if it's something that can be created, it can also be dismantled. And because it's something that created, it's not something we should have to tolerate or live with. It's something that we can fight. And the first step in fighting it is raising our voices together, I think. Getting people to realize it exists and how harmful it is. And so that's why I wanted to share a bit of that podcast with you today. So if I'm not mistaken, now is when we'll play a bit for our participants here. Okay. So right now I'm just going to, I've got a couple episodes queued up. I'm going to play a little clip. Now in each podcast, it's a 6-part series. It's coming out soon. You can find it on covidracism.ca, not yet, but likely in a few days when we launch it. And we'll also announce it on Facebook, Instagram, and there's plans for Spotify as well.
So we are very privileged to have the sneak preview and premiere, right? Thank you.
That's exactly it. So it's not out yet. We're going to play 2 clips today, snippets of the 6-part series. I think before we play, I do want to mention that the reason why we wanted to do these podcasts, also listening in together, is that sometimes as we're in a pandemic, it feels like we're often isolated, and sharing space together to even do something together is a rare occasion. And so that's something that's behind this as well as some of these incidents might be triggering for you. And so something as a preview, just if you need to take care of yourself, take a breather, take a drink of water, or even turn the volume off for a little bit, do what you need to do if it is triggering for you. Okay.
Okay, and with that, I'll play a bit of the first episode.
Podcast is a production. This podcast is a production of the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter. The opinions of those we interviewed do not necessarily represent our own.
The virus originated in Wuhan, China, and that fact has fueled attacks against Chinese Canadians.
Panic about the coronavirus outbreak is fueling a global rise in anti-Asian sentiment.
Racially motivated crimes inspired by fear over the coronavirus.
Wet market animal selling, virus-making greedy bastards.
Labeling the COVID-19 pandemic as a Chinese virus.
A spike in racism. Accusations of racism.
Racism.
Anti-Asian racism.
Anti-Asian racism.
This is Voices of the Pandemic.
Thanks for tuning in to the first episode of Voices of the Pandemic. Now, over the course of this podcast, I'm going to be telling a lot of stories. And that's because stories have such great power in our society. They can shape the way we see others or ourselves. There will be stories of exclusion, stories of resilience, stories that empower. Many of these you might be able to relate to. I know I certainly can, and so I want to begin with my own. My name is Calvin To. I'm a first-generation Chinese Canadian. My parents came here from Hong Kong in the 70s. Growing up, I faced racism. At school, from friends, pretty much everywhere. But until recently, I thought that things had gotten better. Well, that changed when the pandemic hit. I started to get those dirty looks again, looks I haven't seen in Toronto in decades. And I noticed a difference in the way people treated me and my friends who were Asian. Some people started avoiding us. Others were just plain rude. Turns out we're not alone. According to the online survey covidracism.ca, the month of May saw a nearly 8-fold increase in the number of hate-related incidents across the country. Many of them were violent, and the majority targeted people who were Asian. Take, for example, the 92-year-old Chinese man assaulted in Vancouver, or the Chinese convenience store owners beaten in their own store in Toronto, or the Chinese boy called racial slurs and attacked while riding his bike in Saskatoon. The list goes on. But these people are not simply victims. They have stories, lives, histories. These histories often don't make the headlines, which is why this podcast will go beyond the daily stories, so we can get to know the people at the heart of the issue and put stories of racism in the context of the Canadian story. Our guest today is Derek Lang, a fourth-generation Chinese Canadian who lives in Toronto. He works as a visual effects photographer and has traveled the world making Hollywood movies.
Okay, so the beginning of every podcast, I introduce our guest. Each episode is centered around a guest. We talk about their life and either growing up in Canada or coming to Canada, and how racism played a role in their lives. Now, later on in each episode, we talk about the incident that brought them to the survey, the COVID-related racist incident. So I'm going to skip to it now and we'll listen to a bit of it.
You're listening to Voices
of
the Pandemic.
This is how the pandemic changed everything.
Thanks for staying with me. This podcast is based on interviews with people who've experienced racism amid COVID-19. Right now, we're hearing from Derek Lang. He's about to tell us about a racist encounter that happened back in March.
This was just before the pandemic. I was on my way to Steve's music shop. I was in one of those long accordion streetcars going southbound on Spadina. And I was sitting across from this Japanese woman. And I was just sort of like zoned out. I wasn't really thinking about anything. And then all of a sudden, this cup sort of exploded right next to her. And like we kind of looked up and we're like wondering what's going on. And I, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that this person just sort of ran down to the front of the streetcar and she was swearing and stuff like that. You damn Chinese people and your virus, and that was, you know, stuff like that. Like she wasn't actually giving us obscenities like chink or anything like that, but you know, it was definitely directed at us. Like she blamed us for bringing this virus there, and I was just like, I haven't even been to China. And like she had disappeared out of my sight because the streetcar was packed with people, and I was like, well, you know, like I checked with the Japanese woman. She seemed sort of shooken, but she was okay. And like, luckily the cup missed both of us. Like she got a bit of a splash, not much of it, like maybe a drop or two on her, but she was still, you know, she was okay. And then, but then the weird thing is then the woman that threw the cup at us, shouting obscenities and stuff, then started coming back up. She got to our section, and I just got up, and I, without thinking, I just sort of pointed at her, and like my dad just came out like this, you stop right there. And then the next stop, she got off, and then, you know, and then as I was sitting back down, the Japanese woman like thanked me, and then you know, and then eventually I had to get off. But it was just like such a weird thing. I sort of shook it off after, you know, but it was still, I think it took more, I think the Japanese woman was more shocked than I was. Sorry, I'm just like,
Okay, so that's an example of that's the first part of the first episode. At this time, do we want to bring up another poll question? Is that what we want to do?
Yes.
Yeah. I have a question.
So hold that thought. Let's do our poll first before our discussion. So please click in your response. If you have experienced the incident as in this podcast, you can choose as many responses as you like.
We're all set with this poll. Anyone else still reading it?
Yeah, so we could do the second one.
The next poll, or?
Yeah, the next poll.
Okay.
So this one is about if you are a bystander, if you're witnessing that rather than having that happen to you directly, what would you do?
So say I say the N-word, man.
Again, you can do multiple responses.
I say the N-word and I'm white. What would I do, man? Am I racist or am I not racist?
Can we mute our mics if we're not speaking? Thank you.
Can I ask my question now?
Sorry, give us a second, okay?
Okay.
Okay, I think we can share the results now. And then maybe.
So it looks like, yeah, if I could just review some of these answers. It looks like from this question of if you were a bystander and witnessed someone in the situation, what would you do as a bystander? And overwhelmingly, we had 64% of you had said report to authority, followed by 57% of you would provide support to the person in other ways, followed by tied of confront the instigator, to call for help, and finally to keep quiet and get to somewhere safe. And so I think that shows us that when we are even as witnesses and as bystanders, there is possible, and it is possible to be active bystanders and active witnesses. So through these different categories, through these different options, it shows us that that is possible.
Yeah, this is really interesting. You know, I want people to know that when you're either facing racism yourself or you see it happening in public, don't feel bad if you're not sure what to do. There are resources out there that we can point you to that will help, but it's really hard. I was at an event this summer and a very experienced person, older than I was saying, I mean, he's been doing this work for a long time, and he was saying he wishes, kind of jokingly, that there was a list of comebacks that we could refer to, because in the moment it's very hard to know what to do. So I think that's a shared experience, and certainly the people I interviewed, it is very difficult to learn how to respond to racism. It's like freezes you, and that's very common. Did we have another question, or did we want to move on?
I have a question.
Sure, let's take your question. Is it Keith Foster?
Yeah. So if someone was being racist to someone and you reported it to the police, what would they do?
So that's a really good question. And I think even the very act of reporting it to the police sometimes can be controversial, considering that right now we're speaking about anti-Asian racism, but for other groups and other folks, for example, and Black folks or Indigenous folks might be very concerned when they do report to the police how that might even result. As we know, just really recently this year with incidences of anti-Black racism enacted by the police, like individuals like George Floyd, and locally here in Toronto, Regis. And so it is then that is although one way to report to authority, and that is one way. Another way also is often, as we see other resources provided, as a bystander when we're observing interpersonal violence that way, to record it, to document it, to have it on your phone as one way to be actively engaged in all of this, to record and have evidence that way too.
Yeah, I think on Kenneth's point, I think there are examples where East Asians have reported it to the police. They haven't always gotten the results they wanted. One of the podcast episodes, I wasn't planning on playing it tonight, but it's a man who was attacked. He's a man with a disability, and he was attacked in his apartment lobby. And he did report it to police, but you can see when you listen to when that episode comes out, that he was disappointed with how it was handled. There was also a case that made the news. It was on CBC. If you search, I'm sure you can find it. There was a lady in, I believe it was Richmond, BC, several months ago. And she was harassed by a man who was, I think, revving his engine and threatening to run her over. She called the police, and from the article, she was very disappointed with the way that there was a lack of follow-up in that case. And I'm not sure if they ever found the guy, as if the time that the article was published, they had not. So it's just something to be mindful of, that calling the police for some groups, it is, for example, Black and Indigenous people, it's a very scary thing. For Asians, it may be less scary, but it doesn't mean that we might get the help that we're looking to get. So as Kenneth mentions, being an active bystander, recording it, everyone has cell phones these days. That's a very effective thing, because then we can post it on social media. And a lot of the work I was doing this summer, people say that racism has always happened, but now racism is happening and people have cell phones. So we can record these events, and then it becomes undeniable. And I think that's a very powerful thing to do.
I'm also seeing that in the chat. Thank you for the question, Keith Foster. But I'm also seeing in the chat that many of us are sharing resources. That's great. I encourage that all of us, if you've seen different ways and different articles, to also share in the chat. I'm also seeing 2 comments. One saying that there have been reports on the news to the police and that little has been done if it's only verbal harassment. And another comment from Michael H. to say that you might have an experience to talk about involving racism. I'm also mindful of time. Thank you everyone for engaging through the chat. I believe we have a second podcast clip that we'd like to show, Calvin.
I will tell you 2 anecdotes. So the first one happened over Easter weekend. So it was a Saturday on the Easter weekend. I was on my way to go downtown to get groceries. So on this particular day, I was walking along, minding my own business. And then as I was walking along, a car drove by, and the passenger in this car rolled down the window and yelled at me to go home. Now, at first I wasn't sure that it was targeted to me, because there were other people out and about walking around. But then I looked at the people and I saw that everyone was white and I was not white. So I kind of figured out that this person meant go home back to China. And because as the person was pulling away, I kind of kept walking, and I had like the nastiest glare at the person. And I think this person then realized, that I wasn't happy, but the car drove off. So it wasn't like I could run after them. I don't have any superhuman powers and like stop the car and be like, are you talking to me? I really couldn't do that. But it really I felt targeted, I grew up here. I'm a Canadian. Yes, I'm Chinese Canadian, but I'm still a Canadian, and it's not my fault or anybody's fault really that we have a worldwide pandemic. We don't control how viruses spread, right? But definitely to some other people, that is definitely, it was definitely our fault. So that was one example where I felt targeted. Another example was, this happened later on, I would say maybe 3 weeks to a month after. I went to get groceries at a grocery store close to my house. I needed cream for coffee, and I lined up to pay, and the cashier, rang me through. It was like 4 things of cream, gave me a total, and I reached for my wallet, and I only had cash on me. And the cashier looked at me and said, "Do you have any other form of payment?" And I said, "Unfortunately, no, I only have cash." And then she just lost it in front of like all the clients And she was like, oh my goodness, you have to protect us. Now I have to change my gloves. You should everyone has a card nowadays. You should go and get like a one of those visas that you can top up. And I'm sitting here or standing there, and I'm just listening to this cashier going off. And I'm standing here like, I'm just trying to pay for my cream and get out of there. I don't need to be shamed or lectured for using cash. And on top of it, it's like, logically speaking, if you're giving me such a fuss about me paying cash, who's going to take my cash to charge onto a reusable debit card or reusable credit card? And I didn't really want to make a big scene in the grocery store, not because I don't want to, because, growing up here, I'm very well versed in Canadian values of, standing up for myself and being assertive. But I really didn't want to escalate it any further in a sense of everyone's trying their best in the pandemic, everyone's stressed and so on. So I get that. So all I just kind of stated was, well, not everyone has access to card, and we just, we're all just trying our best, and I just left it at that. But I didn't really appreciate the fact that I was lectured for using cash. I understand that it's preferable to pay with card. I get that. I try to follow that, but at the same time, it's like, sometimes I'm only human. I forget to bring my cards. It happens, right? Just didn't appreciate to be lectured at for that. And then I kind of wondered, once again, had I been a white-skinned Canadian, whether or not I would receive this lecture.
All right, so that's the second clip. Do we have another poll coming up?
Sure.
So similar to the last podcast, so the first question is, as if you are the direct target of the incidents, how would you respond? Again, you could choose all the responses that applies.
Okay, are we all good? Is anyone still reading the poll? Okay.
Okay. So as we look at the second, this question, if you've experienced the incident targeted to yourself, what would you do? And we have, again, overwhelmingly 60% confront the instigator, followed by report to authority, followed by something else, as well as then followed by keep quiet, get to somewhere safe, and then finally 10% for call for help. And so that shows already, and these are only a couple of options, obviously, that there's a range of responses, but it seems like overwhelmingly many of us might even confront the instigator and speak up and say something.
So the next question is, if you are a bystander or if you witness this happening to somebody in the community, how would you respond? Ring, would you share the next question?
So we're all good?
So it looks like for this one, as a witness, again, majority confront instigator, then followed by report to authority, provide support to the person in other ways, and call for help. Seems like many of us will approach and do something about it rather than to keep quiet and get to somewhere safe. So that is a difference as a witness. Thank you for participating in these polls. I think it's been really interesting to see of us here together, what are the different responses.
I'm really glad to hear that a large portion of you would actually confront the instigator. It's a really hard thing to do. It's the model minority thing. It's very hard to get out of. A lot of us when we face adversity, when we face racism, we just want to kind of keep our head down and move on. But as evidenced by the kind of thing that happened tonight, someone trying to Zoom bomb an anti-racism workshop, this is work that there's a lot of racism out there, and there's a lot of hate, and this is something we all need to confront together. And I think by raising our voices together, that's part of what I want to do with the podcast. We can shed light on this and we can make a difference.
I think that's what Calvin and I have prepared for today. Also acknowledging that the Zoom bomber have interrupted us, and like what Calvin had said, this work often comes with interruptions and comes with surprises and comes with shock. And I'm really appreciative of the team to have handled it so professionally just now. Thank you, Project Protect. But that's what we have prepared from Calvin and myself.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. I'm wondering whether any of our other team members have any other comments. I really appreciate the fact that, even from two pretty straightforward incidents of racism and in pretty everyday life circumstances, really, right? Riding the TTC or buying groceries or, shopping, those can happen to our lives. And I think there is a range of responses that we often can employ. It depends on the context, obviously, and it depends on whether we have other options available, whether we are alone, whether we are in the company of other people, right? So I think the earlier question was quite helpful. Do we want to, report everything to authority or police, or do we want to confront the instigator? So I think there is no one answer that is the right strategy. I think it all depends on the context. I think the fact that we realize we have the options and we wanted to take some actions, whether the action is to protect our own safety first, or call for help or get support, or directly confront it, or to record that experience and share it with other people and the communities. So those are all possibilities. I think the most useful thing is to realize that we have that options and we have our communities to work with us and to be supportive. So I really appreciate that the reporting mechanism is there. I think maybe, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about like what other plans do you have for sharing these information and the stories that you've collected, and how people can continue to contribute to that experiences. Yeah.
So as the website has been shared multiple times, it's covidracism.ca. It's a straightforward reporting tool, and there are multiple languages available. We will be continuing to collect these reports, and near the end of December, that's when the website will still be open. We encourage you to continue reporting. However, we will be doing a more data interpretation analysis after December 31st. That's sort of as a milestone from this year of 2020. But of course, the reporting tool continues to open. Our idea is that as reports continue on, perhaps with COVID-19 or without COVID-19, we might see some trends shift, to which then moving on to 2021 and ongoing, what that might look like. However, just for our project, the collecting will end December 31st, to which then a report, like a written report, will be produced with recommendations. In addition to everything will be available publicly on that same website, covidracism.ca. So I would encourage all of you to go on that site also as a way to access the podcast that will be posted.
So the other question I have, and I know that we've been working together on this a little bit, is, so I think as Calvin mentioned, this is both, a lot of the times it's a very traumatizing experience, although it is also a time when we, become more resilient and work collectively to combat these racism and discrimination. What type of support and resources have you been able to work with or support the communities that has been experiencing racism and reporting to you through those tools?
So for those, one of the categories, one of the questions that is on the report is on the survey questionnaire is that whether or not you would like to be contacted. So we do not contact you, and your report is anonymous unless you allow for us to, with your consent, for us to contact you, in which then you would provide us with your email. For those individuals who wanted further support and provided us with their contact information, we did reach out, and in some situations we were able to connect to more local resources. We have also passed on to Project Protect, your live chat, and as a resource hub as well, to be connected with more local supports.
So there were a few more questions from our participants before we end off. As well, we do have some polls at the end here, if people can just hang on tight for a bit. We have someone who wants to know how they can get more involved and help out. As well, someone had asked if we recorded or videotaped an incident, where do we send it to? Should we disclose on YouTube or other public forums, or send it to the police?
Oh, Calvin, did you want
to? Go ahead, Candice, yeah.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. Certainly, I think posting it on social media is probably the best thing to do these days. Word spreads fast on social networks. Never thought about YouTube, but that is probably a good way to get it out as well. A lot of the incidents I find, I say this because a lot of the incidents I found, people were sharing it on social media, and you wouldn't believe how fast things can, how fast word can travel. Even if local media doesn't pick it up, there's media online, and that's a great community to do that too. Certainly, if you know who it is, I would reach out to them and see if they've filed a police report. Maybe they want the video. But certainly social media is, and certainly file a report on covidracism.ca. It's quick. It only takes 5 minutes. Click a couple buttons, and you can add your data to our growing data set that we can use for advocacy.
Yeah, and if I can add, I think for any of us to, and we mentioned active witnessing, active bystander, is to consider a couple of things. First of all is our own safety. For example, whether or not you're in public space, whether or not you've recorded and you feel safe enough to post it publicly through social media, that's something you might want to consider first and foremost. Second thing you might want to consider is also your readiness to engage in further conversation. For example, we know that in talking about racism, sometimes it is emotional labor, it is emotional work. And so before engaging in that is to assess and ask ourselves, are we ready to do that? Sometimes if it feels like this would be too much, maybe too triggering, perhaps we have to assess that for ourselves, as our care for ourselves is most important, before the third thing, to speak out or to act or to do something. So we do encourage that, yes, and through this conversation, as we talk about public spaces, it often feels like we should do something right away, but I want to just highlight that your safety and your readiness is most important as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, so maybe as Rain administered the last two poll questions, I wanted to thank our special guest from CCNCTO, but also wanted to recognize that this is really the beginning of the long conversation and the complex conversation on our community's responses to racism and other systemic discrimination. And this is part of the conversation of the series, right? So next week, we would have a special guest from the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic to talk about further understanding of our rights as protected under the Human Rights Code of Ontario and how we can access and utilize that as one of the possible strategies. And then on December 3rd, 2 Thursday from today, we would have distinguished panel of speakers that will tackle the issues of racism in social media and online platform. So that again can help us build further repertoire in terms of dealing with different kind of discrimination. On December 10th, we would have panel that focus on dealing with racism in the dating context, especially in the LGBTQ communities. And on December 17th, we would have a panel that tackles racism when we are accessing public services. So these are upcoming workshops. They will all be happening on Thursday evening, except for next week, which would be 6 to 7. The other ones are all 8 to 9. So we hope that you would join us in the future workshops and also share that with your friends and invite more people. And then also, if you have friends who missed today's workshop, we would be loading that to our YouTube channel. And so please subscribe to it or check us out on those channels. And you can also catch up with the other workshops that we've done in the past. So we have we have another series of programming that feature different community members and resources in fighting racism and dealing with different social issues related to COVID-19. So we already have 2 podcasts with our community members. And next week, we would actually be featuring the executive director from CCNC Toronto, Justin Kong, who would talk further about the work of CCNC Toronto and beyond the anti-racism reporting too, but also the other work that CCNC Toronto is working with other marginalized communities and supporting our communities. So please tune in Tuesday evening at 6 to our Community Partner Showcase and Thursday to our Resiliency Dialogues workshop. So thank you for participating and thank you for participating in the poll. And we'd like to once again thank our special guests, Kenneth and Calvin. You're doing incredibly important work and we are very proud to work with you together.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you and good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
So we could